on violence against women and children. On behalf of our team, I would like to welcome everyone to our webinar today on digital platforms and violence against women, user experiences, best practices, and the law. Please think about the traditional lands you are currently situated on and join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands and in celebrating the continued strength and spirit of Indigenous peoples. The ongoing work to make the promise of truth and reconciliation real in our communities, and in particular to bring justice for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls across the country, should inform our discussions in this webinar and beyond. The presentation will be an hour long, followed by 15 minutes for questions and answers. Please type up any questions or comments that you may have for our speakers into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Earlier today, a link to the presentation slides was emailed to you, and that link is now in the chat box. The presentation will be recorded thanks to the generosity of our presenters and available on our website within the next few days. Some of the content you will hear today is sensitive and may be triggering. We have put a link in the chat box to resources if you wish support. Please take care of yourself. Now I'm honored to introduce our three speakers. Abigail Curlew is a journalist, doctoral candidate, and trans feminist who specializes in advocacy around LGBTQ+ human rights, surveillance studies, and research around social media, doxing, and trolls. She currently holds a Social Science and Humanities Research Council doctoral fellowship and a 2019 scholarship with the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation for her digital ethnographic research and investigative work into the practices of anti-transgender vigilantes and hate groups. Raine Liliefeldt is a communications professional and relationship builder with over 18 years in the nonprofit sector. As the Director of Member Services and Development at the YWCA Canada, Raine is responsible for a number of mission impact projects, including Project Shift, a knowledgeable exchange project on ending tech-facilitated violence against women and girls, and Digital Smarts, in partnership with Media Smarts, a national project that provides free, accessible, and supportive digital literacy training that meets the specific needs of participants from vulnerable populations. She also coordinates national organization meetings, capacity building, and training events. Cynthia Khoo is a technology and human rights lawyer and researcher. She is called to the Bar of Ontario and holds a JD from the University of Victoria and LLM from the University of Ottawa, where she interned at the Samuelson Glusco Canadian Internet Policy and Public Interest Clinic. Cynthia has extensive experience across key technology and human rights issues, such as privacy and data protection, freedom of expression, algorithmic decision-making, technology-facilitated abuse, intermediary liability, copyright, and net neutrality. She is the principal lawyer at Technos Law, a sole practice digital rights law firm, and has represented clients as interveners before the Supreme Court of Canada. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our esteemed panel of speakers, and in particular to start with Abigail.
Can you hear me now? Yeah?
Yes, that's very good.
Okay, sorry, I had my headphones stopped working. Okay, so this story is pretty hard to cover, and revisiting trauma can be incredibly difficult, but there's no shame in wanting to tune out for a bit if you need to. I'm using what media scholar Emma Jane has called a caustic approach to discussing online violence against women, which means that some of my examples of these things said, or the things said to me, uh, emphasize the gravity of hate-motivated violence and the consequences for those who've not ever been forced to experience it. So I apologize in advance for some of the crude language. Oh. Okay, so my scholarly and journalistic work centers around how the work of online hate groups and digital vigilantes contribute to targeted violence against marginalized women. Who in various ways contribute to the public discussion or political discourse over social media and are attacked because of their work. I've spoken to politicians, activists, comic artists, athletes, and other trans women who were forced to deal with online harassment because of lies, smear campaigns, and the distortions of the truth. My research has found that when a trans woman speaks out in a public fashion, there's a very large risk of attracting the wrong kind of audience. And if that audience finds their way into this trans woman's social media presence, the consequences of her speaking out in the first place can be absolutely devastating. As I'll explore a little later, this can include mental health issues, tarnished reputations, fallout with family and members and friends, and sometimes having personal accounts hacked, phone numbers or home addresses leaked online, and the receptions of death threats and threats of sexual assault. In this talk, I won't be going through the stories I've collected for my research as it's still in progress, and I don't want to risk having any of my participants being harassed. But I will tell you my story of my own experiences with this kind of violence and hopefully use that narrative to explore some key topics and issues in the realm of digital violence against women. So before I get into the story though, I think it's worth clarifying my definition of doxing. Doxing is a practice of digging up information on a person to post to hostile publics. It has a long history on the internet as a method to reveal the legal identities of anonymous people online with an intent on revenge or causing harm to a person. Today, it's a well-documented practice used by a whole spectrum of political groups to encourage mass harassment, brigading, and shaming of online users. I understand doxing as existing on a spectrum of severity that ranges from the collection of disparate personal and public information put into a dossier or file to be posted online to some of the more extreme private information such as phone numbers, home addresses, and social security numbers. The function of doxing someone is often done with the apparent intention of using a pastiche of information to illustrate who a person is, and in the case of trolls and vigilantes, like members of from Kiwi Farms, a group that I'll be exploring shortly, use that information to shame their target. I mentioned this as the spectrum of doxing, as there's no shortage of abusers who argue that if there isn't a home address, it isn't doxing, which often results in abusers minimizing the impact of their abuse or gaslighting their targets. So this is an experience that I faced when I came out of the closet as a transgender woman. I began my transition in the first year of my PhD program. It was a time where there was an ongoing national conversation concerning the limits of free speech and expression within the academy. The debate mostly centered on whether it was appropriate or not to misgender trans people or debate our very existence within the classroom or academic setting. Having a vested interest in this conversation and having written about it several times in the past, I wrote an article for Vice Canada and another one for The Conversation that argued that though free speech was of a monumental importance, the use of unfettered free speech that ignores the impact of hate-motivated violence serves to silence marginalized people. As the national debate concerned issues of misgendering in the classroom, the threatening environment around the debate made it incredibly difficult for trans people to engage in a conversation without being targeted by hate groups or humoring bad faith arguments about our existence. I asked for a nuance in the debate and argued that unfettered free speech of the privileged has the potential to poison the well for others who don't share in that privilege. If the consequences of speaking out for trans women and other women is exposure to violence and scrutiny from anonymous far-right groups, among others, there will inevitably be women who won't feel safe to speak out. So following the publication of these articles, I began getting a lot of nasty DMs to my inboxes and Google alerts that my name was mentioned on the internet. When I began to poke around to see where I was mentioned, it turned out that my name was being featured on a website called Kiwi Farms. This is a website of troll vigilantes who crowdsourced the surveillance, doxing, and harassment of trans women who've somehow contributed to the political discourse and are read by these vigilantes as fitting under the political stereotype of a social justice warrior or SJW. Members of this web community focus what seems to be an extraordinary amount of time and effort monitoring trans women, collecting intelligence, and inventing disinformation to post amateur dossiers to or files to their forum boards. To really appreciate the offensive tone to their website, here's an old quote that had once been featured on their sign-up page, and I do apologize for the language. Quote, "Autistics will be laughed at, trannies will be misgendered, people will try to find out where you live." This website has built a notoriety within the trans community for their vicious and often unrelenting attacks on trans women online. And though almost every trans woman I've spoken to has heard of this group, very few cisgender people have. And it's worth mentioning that though members of Kiwi Farms seem to have an extreme fixation on trans women, they also target a wider range of marginalized people. Kiwi Farms represents a community where far-right politics and vigilantism intersect with the culture of trolling. What I mean by this is that members of Kiwi Farms are informed by a wider community with its roots in populism, fascism, white supremacy, and cis heteropatriarchy. And they use these influences to justify what is ostensibly extrajudicial violence through monitoring, doxing, and harassing trans women. But they are also informed by a culture of trolling that takes enjoyment out of harassing others for a reaction. In other words, they do it for the lulz or to get entertainment out of watching others react to being harassed. One of the most popular categories that Kiwi Farms trolls use to engage in their harassment is that of the lol cow. This is a metaphor to imply a person who can be milked for the lulz. From this perspective, or from the perspective of Kiwi Farms trolls, lol cows are identified as users who might exhibit a strong emotional reaction to being doxed or harassed. They try to herd lol cows into a satisfying emotional reaction that they can use to fuel continued harassment of them. And unfortunately, I was easily slotted into this category. So from what I could gather, based on the post on the thread, trolls at Kiwi Farms first learned about me when one of my articles on free speech was posted to a Twitter account called @abortionsforall. A user on Kiwi Farms forum, a user on the Kiwi Farms forum board then posted a dox about me that had included information about my history on the internet, my dead name, my pre-transition photos, old names that I've gone under, accounts with different pseudonyms that they were able to link to my legal identity, and my connections to other trans women and links to my social media accounts. This included screenshots of embarrassing posts that I thought were anonymous and screenshots of tweets I made to drive the point home that I was indeed an SJW. For those who might be unfamiliar with trans women, many of us are very opposed to references of our past selves. When a dead name or pre-transition photo is used as a form of harassment, it's often as a method to accuse us of lying to the world or to ourselves. And it's often a trigger point for gender dysphoria. This is a deep feeling of disgust and alienation about our bodies that tends to be alleviated when we transition. And people feel this to a varying degree. But knowing this full well, Kiwi Farms trolls weaponize this information about our past lives against us. They know where to punch us to make us hurt. When information is posted to the forum, other users contribute by either posting more found information or by posting horrible things to insult their targets. And these posts are often picked up by the Google algorithm and take a prominent position in any Google search of their target. For me, these posts were near the top of the page when my name was Googled. And after 3 years, so these posts have receded into the background of my Google imprint. For a long time, people could easily find this docs and read through it. There's always a vulnerability and fear that comes out of being featured on a hostile website like this. Who will believe the disinformation? How will it impact me getting a job? Will this impact how my friends and family see me? It's this culture of visibility that characterizes our lives on the internet and fuels the fodder for online attacks. Many of us have a long history of using social media, forum boards, and blogs that we may have used without the knowledge that someone in the future would be able to search around and find the things we posted in the past. And most people have posted something or another that's embarrassing or can be taken out of context and shown in a new light that implies some form of incrimination. It's not until someone gets doxxed and harassed that the heavy knowledge of how much of our lives have become visible to the public really sets in. Surveillance scholar Daniel Trottier calls this phenomenon the weaponization of visibility, where vigilantes with some basic knowledge of how to use the internet and do research are able to collect, distort, and use information as a form of violence. Largely on Kiwi Farms, most of the posts are made to delegitimize a trans woman's identity and paint trans people as either mentally ill or delusional. The following posts are a few samples of things said to me. One user posted, quote, "They do it to escape their insecurity or their mistakes from their male self. Unfortunately, the internet never forgets, nor does their body, which is male." Another user wrote, quote, "An obvious man with male chromosomes thinks he's a girl. He's not a girl, he's mentally ill. The tank man and the troon man, which is lingo from Kiwi Farms, can live out their fantasies. That's okay and that's fair, but you can't change reality. Even if you get the tank gun of an MK2 installed on your face, you're still a man and not a tank." And in reference to the articles I wrote, another user said, quote, "If accommodating the 0.1% of people who are trannies involves destroying free speech for everyone else, fuck trannies," unquote. It's worth noting that I've had it easy in comparison to some of the women I've spoken to. One person I interviewed had hundreds of pages of posts on a thread, and at one point was receiving hundreds of messages a minute to her Twitter inbox with incredibly abusive content. As this form of abuse snowballs, it can have humongous impacts on the life of, or on a woman's life. A notable, sorry, just a check on the time. I know I had a technical difficulty and just stop me when we get to the 20-minute part. A notable trend at Kiwi Farms is that when a user strikes back and calls out the abuse or provides a rebuttal to that disinformation, they will often reframe their attacks as a form of valid public criticism and turn around the criticism to say if we didn't say something in the first place, that they wouldn't have doxed us. On my post, they went so far as to edit the post and remove or change information in response to my criticisms. And this becomes a form of gaslighting, and it can be incredibly influential. One user wrote, quote, "Someone who has a humiliation fetish or desperately wants someone to find the skeletons in his closet." Another user wrote, "So there's a cybersecurity tip for you. If you don't want a threat on here, don't post stupid shit online." At the time I was doxxed, I was absolutely mortified and spent a lot of time reading the posts and checking for updates. I was afraid that the things that a bunch of anonymous anti-trans trolls would make up about me, or the information that they would make public. When I started reading the gaslighting posts, it forced me to question myself, and I began to put blame on myself for what was happening. I felt isolated and alone and embarrassed. And at one point, my partner at the time had to convince me to stop using the internet and take a break. And of course, I did and managed to find some perspective through all that, but it didn't erase the impact of, or the fear of being spied on by people who hate me because of who I was born as. Our presence on the internet is often not negotiable. For many of us, it's an essential space to connect with our friends and families and communities. For others, we might be tethered to the internet for work. You might be an artist, an activist, or a journalist and rely on your connection to social media to do that work. This is especially the case during the COVID crisis, where many of us are unable to leave our homes and use our connections to the internet as a way to engage with work, friends, family, or politics. To be pushed off the internet is to foster a fear of missing out on important social and economic connections. And it's just not reasonable for people to have to leave the internet in order to be safe. After the time I was doxxed by Kiwi Farms, I realized how vulnerable my presence was on the internet. And as a politically involved trans woman, it wasn't the first nor the last time that I would have to face being doxxed or harassed online. My biggest observation that came out of this experience was that my subject position, my identity as a trans woman, was one of the central factors in getting targeted in the first place. I've written controversial articles before when I was presenting as a man, and it had not even close to the same impact. And this isn't to say that men aren't impacted by more toxic elements of the internet, but it does mean that men generally avail of an invisibility in comparison to other people who face that kind of marginalization and oppression. So I don't have time to get into any meaningful advice about defending yourselves against this kind of violence, but I've included a few resources on the slides for fostering a good security plan. And the PowerPoint slides are online on the website if you want to download them and avail of these resources. And thank you so much for hearing my story and dealing with the technical difficulties at the beginning. Thanks.
So I think Raine is going next. Thank you, Raine.
Thank you so much, Abigail, for sharing. It's brave. It sucks. That's all I can say. And it just means so much that we have these spaces, and hopefully that the 581 and plus folks are going to work together to end this kind of violence. And yeah, so just wanted to acknowledge and thank you for sharing. So my name is Raine Liliefeldt. My pronouns are she and her. I am a settler and honored to work in Takaranto, Toronto, the traditional territory of many First Nations people, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewas, the Haudenosaunee. And the Wendat people. And the city is now home to many diverse First Nations and Inuit and Métis people. And as we convene in this online space, let's be mindful that this space isn't always safe for all of us. And we've learned and we know that it's a tool of oppression towards Black, Indigenous women, racialized women, gendered and sexual minorities, people with disabilities, and others who experience intersecting forms of marginalization. This just makes this conversation more important, that we do our part to keep online spaces safe. So I'll share that, thank you for my intro. I am not an expert on security, safety, or privacy. I have been doing this work alongside a lot of really amazing academics and legal folks and folks in the tech sector for a couple of years now, partly because of Project Shift and also because of my own interest and loving and wanting to keep people safe. So Project Shift is a cross-sectoral project. Our goal was to create a safer digital world. And through a series of recommendations that flowed from that project, we worked with the information communication technology sector to address product and policy changes. And it was then that we realized just how important digital literacy is, in not only for adults who are the trusted adults that girls and young women and non-binary folks are going to for support when an instance occurs, but also for our frontline workers who are supporting women who are leaving situations of violence and entering shelters. So we developed this training. It is usually about an hour long or even longer. But what I'm going to share with you over the next few minutes is really just a snapshot. YWCA also has a staff sector network for our colleagues who are working in this area. And in the coming months, we'll be hosting a webinar that's a little bit longer, and I'll invite you to stay in touch or check out the YWCA's website to learn more. So this is the online abuse wheel, and it was created by Soraya Shimali and Debyani Roy. It was created with the understanding that online harassment and abuse sits on this continuum of gender-based violence. And we know that as new technologies are being developed, they're being developed on a daily basis. And as fast as they are being developed, they're being misused. So just out of curiosity, I'm going to ask Sarah to put up a poll now. Just want to see who essentially is in this virtual room with us. If you can put up the poll, I just want to know, are you a frontline worker? Yes or no? And if so, does your organization offer digital safety planning in your intake process? So I'll give you a really short period of time to answer the question. Thank you. Awesome. Okay, that is some really interesting information. And more we recognize that it's going to be really helpful to do that intake process with folks who are coming into shelters. And I'll share a really quick story with you as to why. And you probably have some of these stories as well. So when YWCA, we were doing a pilot project with Facebook to support women who were coming into shelters who are fearing that their partner may share an intimate image of them without their consent. There was an opportunity for us to preemptively have that photo uploaded and hashed so that it can't be shared further. Well, in having a conversation with my colleague to prepare for a training, she shared with me that yes, this is so needed, and essentially shared that recently, there was a case where a woman who was at the shelter, she was going to receive a police escort to go back to her home to collect her belongings and some of her child's belongings, and then to return to the shelter. Well, while she was there, she saw her partner's cell phone. She took it and she left along with her belongings and returned to the shelter. Well, you can imagine, very shortly after, there was a knock on the shelter door. He had found her. And of course, we had to, in that case, move her and her child to another shelter for safety. So again, it could have been a very quick conversation that would have reminded someone around that kind of safety planning. So we're living in this data, information, persuasion-driven age. Our devices are getting smarter and smarter. They are predictive, they are responsive. And I don't know about you, but my phone is really smart. My phone knows my name, my age, my gender, what I do, how much I make. My phone knows my face, my fingerprints. It knows the sound of my voice. Sometimes, even though Siri is very good at ignoring me, it knows what I'm going to say before I'm going to say it in terms of text messaging. It knows where I am, where I'm going, and how fast I'm going there. And it also knows what's around me, what Wi-Fi networks are around me, so it can geolocate me. So I say this because if my phone knows this, then that means someone who has my device or has this information will also know this about me. And also means that ICT firms also would have this information. Please give me a thumbs up if my speed is okay. I guess I can't see everyone's thumbs up, so thank you, panelists. So for those of you who have computers on site, if it is a shelter or a counseling space, many of us provide space for women to access their emails, etc., set up appointments. So there's a couple of questions to think through. If you have computers on site, are your service users being made aware of ways to keep themselves and those around them safe? If they're allowed to use video messaging, can they confidently and safely do so? Does their social media let people know where they are at a particular moment? Do they know how to disable those settings? So it's a big question to check around your computer security on site. We recommend often, and literature recommends as well, that you could use a VPN, a virtual private network, which allows you to create a connection over a less secure network between your computer and the internet that protects privacy. Also, incognito windows are also incredibly helpful, or using a browser like DuckDuckGo, for example, that has heightened security. So here's another quick polling question. It's really recommended for us to check our privacy settings and policies. So Sarah, if you can post the next question. Perfect. So how often are you checking your privacy settings? Never? When the seasons change, monthly, when there's a new operating system, with every new app or update, or as often as you remember? Another really quick couple of seconds to answer that. And it'll give me a second to breathe. Okay, well, our friends, most of those answers are correct, except never. Never is not correct. It's a really good idea to check your privacy settings as often as you can, as often as you remember. There's a possibility you can create a calendar reminder for yourself on your phone to check your privacy apps. When you're changing the battery for your smoke detector, check your privacy settings. The other things that I also often check are things like my GPS location information on my phone, on my devices. I turn those off because Uber doesn't need to know where I am if I'm not asking it to take me somewhere else. And so also I check my microphone settings, camera access, and passwords. So passwords. It's really good to change them as often as you can remember. especially with service users who are entering shelters, to remind them to change those passwords or even set up whole new email addresses that their partners might not be aware of, to communicate with service providers. Who would, especially passwords are really clear because we often use passwords that we know. So it's good to change them. The other information I hope that folks are being mindful of is to not use information on the internet that includes your first name, last name, date of birth, social insurance number, address, bank account information, driver's license, any identification, credit card number, passport. All of that is no. I don't know if you gave a giggle when you saw this slide, but the best practice is actually to use what is probably the last password on this list. And that's probably something that's around 15 characters long. Another really good tip is I try not to use English very much for my passwords because English is easily hacked. Password lockers are also helpful. You just have to remember that one password and then you can see the others. You just have to remember that password. The other thing too is if you are, I don't know if you've seen lately these little password books, I would definitely, if you want to use that, try and figure out some kind of encryption code that no one's going to know so that you can use it. But because if you lose it, it's not so good. The other thing that's also highly recommended is setting up a two-factor authentication system as well. That's much safer. So social media, another really key piece to check the settings. They're often, I know of a case where a woman who had left her community and was being searched for by her partner was posting every time she went to a restaurant near the shelter about her favorite snack. And that's where she was found, at the restaurant a few blocks away from the shelter. So some information, as you know, is default on social media. It's always public, while others you can choose who sees what. So it's good to regularly review who's on those lists. For women who are creating a safety plan of their own to leave a situation of violence, we recommend, if you're setting up an account that is really generic, not using your actual name, setting up a fake name, a fake profile picture like a sunset, not posting anything, also don't use hashtags as well. They can also provide information around location, times, and events. Not to use geotagging in your posts as well, but generally it's helpful to check social media. Most social media platforms now also have safety centers. It's really recommended that you connect into those to see how to report a post, how to report an incident of a photo shared without your permission or the service user's permission, for example. Okay, so often when women are arriving at shelters, they are bringing their children bring their toys. That's kind of what happens. Toys are also smart like my phone. So toys, they could look like a regular toy, doll, bear, etc., racing car, drone, but those are often Bluetooth or Wi-Fi enabled. They are, they include sensors that can record voice, that can take images or video, that can detect your location. And it's important to recognize that, if someone can access the toy, they can also perhaps speak to someone who's within range of the child or that person. So it's good to read through terms of service for those toys. Some companies share that data for marketing purposes, but also just double check the Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, turn that off, check the privacy settings. It's also a really good idea to change your Wi-Fi passwords often. And these are the passwords in the space, and to provide an update to everyone so that, again, we don't become complacent around that and put ourselves at risk. So another really good thing to think about is all of those things that are GPS enabled, Fitbits, location enabled apps, smartwatches, etc. Because it is really easy to track. Also for folks who are using Map My Run or other kind of running apps and posting their runs, that also gives someone an exact idea of where you are and when. So microchips are also another thing that exist at the moment, and it's good to sort of, when someone's coming in, if you can take a quick look. So for example, a microchip you might purchase because you lose your keys often and you don't want to do that anymore, so this will allow you to find your keys. Well, if that exists for that purpose, it can also be used to track or surveil someone. The other, I realize I'm going probably too fast now. But I'll just keep going. So another really interesting area that it might not apply directly to the shelter setting specifically, but women who are coming into shelters who've experienced intimate partner violence may have been subjected to surveillance through stalkerware or spyware. So, you know, abusers can use smart technology and spyware to stalk, harass, and emotionally victimize without having to be in the physical presence of their partner. And the awesome team that Cynthia Khoo is a part of at the Citizen Lab released a really great report last year, Installing Fear, a Canadian legal and policy analysis of using, developing, and selling smartphone spyware and stalkingware applications. I highly recommend you give this a read. It provides really great information about how spyware is being used and marketed, some of the legality of all of that. But the other thing too is that it's also possible for an abuser to use what's existing in an app or in a device already to turn it into a stalkerware. I shared the example with you in terms of how someone was able to use the Find My Phone app to find their person, and that's absolutely possible to use some of the other apps as well, or look at someone's Wi-Fi networks. But spyware is also there, and it's being marketed. Things like FlexiSpy, for example, might not be, you might not see an ad targeted for an abuser to stalk their person, but you might see some other Google analytics around that, or AdWords being directed to folks who are looking for that kind of, who are searching for those kind of things. So know that it's possible with spyware to surveil, to track someone, to check the kind of apps that they're using, the sites that they're visiting, messages, emails, all of those things through the spyware. Back to my friends Siri, Alexa, and Echo, and Google Home. This again, not so incredibly relevant to the shelter setting, but again, it's possible that it could be used. You know, there have been some headlines and mishaps that have occurred around some of our favorite bits of tech. And it's good to be aware that this technology, you know, again, there's ambient listening all the time, so it's important to turn that off. You know, they're sort of waiting for a voice command. And so if that information is open, it's easy for someone to access that as well. Again, recommend, you know, changing Wi-Fi passwords, changing the settings, the privacy settings on those devices, reading the terms of service. I know it's a real challenge to do some of those things, but it's helpful. And then also, you know, unplug or disconnect. It's also possible now to add these devices to court orders. Again, not necessarily something that would be in the shelter, but, well, we would be using security cameras in the shelter, but these are sort of more smart security cameras that we're using at home. And there have been cases where like Amazon Ring has been hacked, and people are able to view security footage of a home and even talk through the device. So again, really helpful to change default passwords on the device, change the Wi-Fi passwords regularly, and face the security cameras away. Just a couple more slides and I'll wrap it up. We have really great tech these days that are it's not even in a phone, it is in a card. So our public transit cards, like in Ontario, we have Presto, and there's some around the country. If you've registered your card, or if your service user has registered their card so that they can easily add money to it, it's also easily traceable. So when I'm using my card, if I do leave my house these days, I'm going to tap on and tap off somewhere, which means that you could easily see a pattern of where I live, where I'm going, and roughly when I'm doing exactly that, so that I can be tracked through that way. So again, good to turn off the anonymization, turn on the anonymization factors on the transit cards. And finally, just to sort of, something that is possible as well is that when women are presenting at the shelter and they are bringing pets, then sometimes those pets, if there's a tracking device in the pet, there's Pet Tracker that has GPS tracking that can share the historical route of the pet. Or there's microchips as well. And those microchips are not GPS enabled, but they do pose a risk to people who are fleeing gender-based violence. That is just a quick snapshot of a little bit of best practices. I hope it was helpful for you, and happy to share more and resources so that you can learn more. Thank you.
And Cynthia, we're going to turn it over to you now.
Hey, hi everyone. Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen and double check that people can hear me.
Yes, they can, Cynthia.
Oh, okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. And thank you so much to my amazing co-panelists, Abigail and Raine. My section of this panel will be to discuss some of the legal responses associated with gender-based violence and abuse on digital platforms. And I think you'll find that there is still very much a gap between where the law is and where lived experience is when it comes to these issues. And this is why I'm so thankful for people like Abigail and Raine who are on the front lines, on the grounds. I tend to be, because the law can be fairly abstract, and I find that the closer I get to the facts on the ground, the more depressing and infuriating it is to work on these issues. And I feel like, and part of my job, I think, is to help close that gap from the perspective of the law, to make the law more sensitive to that on the ground context and be able to embed those issues and that recognition of how technology mediates gender-based violence and abuse in the law itself, rather than ignores it or downplays it, which is, I think, we've seen too frequently. So with that said, I'm going to give a brief overview based on some of the work that I've done in the very generous bio given earlier. I've worked across many fields in technology law and policy, but specifically I have done a lot of work on intermediary liability and platform regulation and the impacts of platform facilitated harms in marginalized groups. And more recently, I've been working with the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, also known as LEAF, on a specific project to write a report on looking at ways to hold digital platforms liable or accountable for gender-based violence and abuse. And I think at this point, I'll just give a note on terminology too, is I'll probably kind of switch back and forth between gender-based violence and abuse against women, because I know that those terms are kind of contested and they mean different things to different people, but just to acknowledge that the spectrum of harms and abuses and who is generally harmed through these contexts. So as an overview of my presentation, well, I basically just did the introduction, then I'll give an overview of laws that are used to address the direct perpetrators and abusers of harms, so the people doing the actual stalking and harassment and intimidation and so forth. But where the bulk of my work actually lies is not in laws that address the direct perpetrators, which so many people have done such excellent work on already. I'm more interested in the platforms themselves, and how do you hold Facebook and Google and YouTube accountable for the harms that their users engage in, which raise so many fascinating and hard and complicated issues, because what you're trying to do legally is to hold one party liable for the actions of another party, i.e. their users, which in the past wouldn't have seemed like a necessarily intuitive or right thing to do. But of course, the power of online platforms and the role that they play in our lives today, as Abigail said, we don't really have a choice now, raises a lot of questions about rearrangements of power and whether more responsibility legally should follow that power. So to begin with, it's worth noting that when it comes to technology facilitated violence and abuse against women, girls, and other marginalized identities, it is not just one thing, it's a web. So this image is taken from a presentation I actually did last year on stalkerware, where initially I had one of these nodes was highlighted, said that's stalkerware, all the other nodes are everything else. But since this is about all forms of tech facilitated violence generally, you can see that they all interact with each other. And it's not just as if one person will only experience one thing at a time. Sometimes it's a constellation of impacts that will coalesce on a same person. And then by the same token, if you look at the box below, the legal responses also have to be a constellation of responses, and actually not just legal responses. You'll note that in the box, law is just one of them, law and regulation, and that is actually almost like the measure of last resort, because the law is a really blunt tool. And a lot of times it won't get to the actual root problems, which is why I have also listed here things like training law enforcement and the courts to understand how technology mediates gender-based violence and abuse, increasing diversity in the technology sector so they stop building technology that is designed almost to harm people in the first place. And then of course, changing social and cultural norms, because at the end of the day, the patriarchy is not a technological problem, it's a political problem. But for the purpose of the presentation, I'll be focusing on the law. So to begin with, the criminal law, of course, is the first port of call for most people. Someone in the Q&A asked if doxing is a criminal offense. It can be. It really depends on the way in which the person was doxed, because just the act of doxing, for example, that could be an invasion of privacy, which is in and of itself is not necessarily a criminal offense. You could sue someone for invading privacy, which I'll talk about later. But if a specific circumstance where doxing maybe could engage a criminal offense is if you used stalkerware, for example, you installed on someone's phones, you intercepted their social, say their private texts between them and another person, got their photos, got personal information, and then doxed them using that, then interception of private communications is the criminal offense. And that is the part that maybe you could get them on. Because that's what you use to dox the person. And so that's an example of a communications-related crime. Other examples that you see here on the slide are fear-based crimes, where you're trying to cause fear or to intimidate another person, such as criminal harassment, threats of violence, intimidation. And then there's a rising arena of what Daniel Citron calls sexual privacy, and related laws are starting to emerge to address that as well, such as non-consensual distribution of intimate images, which is colloquially known as revenge porn, but I think most people here are probably aware that we're trying to move away from that language because it has a lot of misogynistic and victim-blaming implications built into it. Whereas non-consensual distribution of intimate images, bit of a mouthful, but it is, I think, a more accurate term in terms of what is really going on and doesn't have those other associations. So benefits of the criminal law is that it does have expressive impact, because when something is made a crime, that's the state saying, we think that this conduct is so wrong, it's not enough to leave it a private matter, to let someone deal with it themselves. We are going to make it a public matter of the state, because this is a public wrong and something that we don't want to tolerate as a society. Drawbacks, of course, are that you lose control. If you're a victim or a survivor of tech facilitated violence and you try to prosecute as a criminal case, it won't be you doing it. It will be the Crown prosecution taking over the case, and you no longer have control of what happens. That's also assuming that they decide to take it on in the first place, which they might not, because we know law enforcement and the criminal justice system is extremely non-sensitized, first to gender-based violence in the first place, and then you add on technological illiteracy on top of that, and people saying, well, it's just Facebook, like what's the big deal? So there's a lot of barriers with that respect. And then even built into the law, for example, to prosecute a hate speech crime, you actually need to get permission from the Attorney General before you can even go ahead with that, even if they decided to. And then, of course, we kind of mention the criminal justice system without acknowledging the historical and ongoing systemic discrimination against Black, Indigenous, other racialized communities, LGBTQ community, people who live with disability or mental illness, which oftentimes when you empower the state or empower carceral institutions, they are generally just turned back around on these most marginalized groups whom technology facilitated abuse laws are supposed to help in the first place. That's why I think we have to be really careful when it comes to engaging or strengthening the criminal justice system, because it's very double-edged. And then of course, at the same time, they might not actually help in the first place when it comes to gender-based violence and abuse, because of the historical trivialization and dismissiveness of gender-based crimes, sexual violence against women, and so forth. Something to note though is the courts are starting to recognize technology-facilitated violence. So this one case from Alberta, where the accused put keyloggers on their ex-partner's computer, hacked into her cell phone and bank accounts, and sent new photos to her friends, family, and coworkers under her own email. So in this decision, the judge noted that tech-facilitated harassment can be uniquely devastating and worse than traditional harassment because physical distance no longer works as a safety measure. He noted that the trauma, the fear, the intimidation that goes with the course of harassment is the harm itself. Another emerging concept I mentioned earlier that is worth paying more attention to going forward in this area is that of sexual privacy, coined by Danielle Citron, a law professor at Boston University and a leading privacy and technological gender violence scholar, and I think a recent recipient of MacArthur Grant. The term refers to a distinct privacy interest around access to and information about the human body, sex, sexuality, gender, and intimate activities. Protecting sexual privacy is necessary to upholding sexual autonomy and consent, human dignity, intimacy, and equality for marginalized communities. And the reason that sexual privacy is particularly important in the context of tech-facilitated violence is because it is such a gendered phenomenon, and oftentimes sexuality is weaponized against women and other marginalized communities. So they're generally more vulnerable to sexual privacy violations, online sexual harassment, and the more severe consequences of being harassed in that way. So the core harm here is not only one of privacy, but also equality as well when you look at the connection to marginalized communities. I mentioned that criminal law was just one avenue of recourse. The other is privacy and tort laws. So a tort is basically, for those who don't know, it's just the fancy legal term for a wrong. So tort law is basically anytime you hear about one private party suing another private party, that is probably a tort. So examples are invasion of privacy, intentional infliction of mental suffering. So if someone is harassing you online and it doesn't happen to reach the level of what the state considers is a crime, then you can still sue them in a civil court. And with pros and cons of that are you have complete control over your case. But of course, it's an access to justice question where you have to be able to afford the case, to pay a lawyer, to take it on, to have the time to take off work if you need to do that. And with respect to remedy or compensation, then sometimes that may be available and sometimes maybe not, depending on how the court assesses the damages and the harms that happen to you. There are some types of laws where you don't have to show that harm happened to you because the fact of what they did is considered to be harm in and of itself, like privacy, for example. But then there are other instances that may be more dependent on showing harm, in which case there's generally a bias towards physical harm, where even though psychological harm is supposed to be recognized in theory, it doesn't always necessarily play out that way. So those are just some considerations. Another thing is that recently emerging almost novel take on tech-facilitated gender violence is the idea of product liability. So this is the point at which we start leaving the arena of going after the direct perpetrator and abuser and shifting our focus on how to apply the law to the digital platforms themselves. There's a really interesting case in the United States called Herrick and Grinder, where a man was, what happened is that he met someone on Grindr, they dated for a while, and then they broke up, and his ex-partner set up hundreds of profiles on Grindr impersonating him, inviting men from the app to come over to have sex with him, and telling these men that he wanted it to be non-consensual sex, and if he said no, to play along, but this was the partner doing it. And so hundreds of men were pursuing this lawyer's client, showing up at his house, at his work, and Grindr wasn't doing anything about it. So they sued Grindr, so they didn't sue the X, they sued Grindr, and not under traditional past cases that have generally been barred by US law that immunizes platforms for what their users do. They said they tried to frame it as a product liability case. They said Grindr was defective. They had made an error in how they designed their platform because it was virtually a certainty that an app like this would lead to cases of abuse and harassment and violence. And if Grindr didn't do anything about that, knowing that would happen, then that was a defect in their product, which is this app that is held out as something where people are not supposed to have to expect violence and abuse as a result of using their product. So that was a really interesting way of framing the case. Unfortunately, they lost at multiple levels of court, but I think that we could expect to see people trying things like that again, because there is a rising sense, and in terms of public opinion and among different human rights and legal communities, that the current status quo is it's no longer satisfactory, that platforms are too powerful to enjoy the immunity that they have been to date. And what might have made sense in the 1990s doesn't really make sense now. And so this is where we get to where my focus has really been, as I said, focusing specifically on the platforms themselves. There is a few different, so basically we are going through a mass experiment right now all around the world, because different countries are experimenting with different ways to hold platforms liable for user-generated harm and abuse. In Canada, we don't actually have one law across the board yet that says platforms are liable for this kind of abuse or they're not liable. In the United States, they do have one. It's known as Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And it says online platforms are not liable, period. Because if the user did it, then only the user can be held liable. It doesn't matter if the platform enabled it. It doesn't matter if the platform knew about it. They were just the host. They were just the intermediary. So an analogy is like if someone spammed you over the telephone or prank called you, you wouldn't sue the telephone company. You would go after the prank caller or the spammer. So that's the analogy they're using. It doesn't quite translate as well now for all the reasons that I mentioned in terms of the power of platforms and the role they play in our lives today. But that's the United States. Europe has gone in the opposite direction, where they have said if a platform knows about it, they can be held liable for certain things, such as defamation and copyright. And in Canada, we've been approaching it on a kind of more piecemeal basis, where we've said, okay, here's one standard of liability for copyright, and here's another standard of liability for defamation. And it's kind of been done on a piece by piece basis like that. We don't have one overarching law that applies to all situations like in the US or EU. But that is all general. None of that has to do with gender-based violence and harm, which is actually quite frustrating, because it seems like all of the people pushing against platform liability are free expression advocates or the tech companies themselves. And all of the people historically that have pushed for platform liability has really been the copyright industry, like the legacy film and music industries, in a way that does not pay attention at all to freedom of expression or human rights concerns. They just care about their copyright royalties. And so those two forces have basically shaped the debate of platform liability to date. And things like gender-based harm, violence against women have kind of gotten lost in the cracks between those two. And so that's something I'm hoping to bring more attention to as well. But now countries are starting to build frameworks to address online violence specifically. And because Canada hasn't yet, I've been looking a lot at other jurisdictions who have been a bit more proactive to see what they've done and what lessons we can learn. So this slide here is not exhaustive at all, but there's some of the more prominent examples you might come across. So the first example is a law in Germany called NetzDG. And the model is that online platforms are legally obligated upon being notified that there's illegal content on their site, not just hate speech, any type of legal content, has to be taken down within 24 hours. And if 24 hours, if it's obviously illegal, and 1 week, if it's a bit more borderline. And if they don't, I don't remember the exact number, but they're subjected to really high fines, like a non-negligible amount of money. And so platforms in Germany are extremely incentivized to go after unlawful content, including content that might be harmful to the degree that it's been made a criminal or otherwise illegal offense. Another model that has been developing is in the United Kingdom. It hasn't been put into place yet. It's only been proposed as a government white paper, and we don't expect to see actual legislation until late 2021, even 22 or 23. But it's really interesting because this white paper, they proposed applying a duty of care to online platforms, where what the vision is that for every different type of harm, whether that's text facilitated violence, hate speech, terrorist speech, counterfeits, the government would produce a certain standard of care saying you have to do all these things to meet your obligations in addressing this type of harm. And if you don't, you either have to explain what you've done instead, or we will have considered you to have breached your duty of care, and then there will be penalties for that. And then the third model is what I would call centralized content moderation. And other people, Evelyn Duet, she actually calls these content cartels, because what happens is that it's a group of platform companies who have banded together to centralize and agree on what content they all agree should be banned or should be allowed to stay up on their platforms. So if you imagine Google, Facebook, YouTube, Microsoft, Twitter all come together and they all agree, okay, here's our database of content that is banned. So anytime any one of them puts something in that database, boom, now it's gone on all of them at once. So this started off as an initiative to address terrorism with the GIFCT, but of course, once governments started getting in on it, because some of them are just companies, but some of them are companies working with state governments to decide what kind of content should be moderated and shouldn't be moderated, that remit has started expanding. So people are looking at what's been happening with terrorist content. They're saying, hey, it'd be really great if we could also use this for deepfakes, also use this for disinformation, also use this for hate speech. But of course, some things are much more difficult to agree on a standardized definition. So child sexual abuse material, for example, is very narrowly defined, very clear to identify what it is and isn't. But then when you go on to something like criminal harassment, how do you define what that is and isn't? Should there even be one central definition? This is why Duet calls it a content cartel, because once you set up an institution like that, how do you get out of it? And how do you ensure that there's still diversity of content and that there's still ways to contest wrong decisions, for example, or what happens to borderline content that maybe is dicey, but still legitimate and shouldn't necessarily be taken down through a privatized arrangement between all the major platforms. And then of course, overarching all of these in this box at the bottom is that there is some convergence on looking to international human rights law to balance out things like freedom of expression, balance with the right to equality, and freedom from discrimination. Online platforms do have freestanding obligations to uphold human rights under the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights. And then in Canada too, I haven't seen this argument made yet. I kind of made it in my own head, but there's an argument that some human rights codes in Canada, if you look at online platforms as public services, like a retail store, even holding out services to the public, and if they're not allowed to discriminate on the basis of protected characteristics, then there is an argument there that if they are not working to make Facebook as inhabitable or as usable an environment for women, trans people, other marginalized communities, for example, then arguably they're violating that obligation to offer their services equally to everyone, and not end up with a discriminatory impact on people from marginalized communities. I am way over time, I'm so sorry. So I will just leave up the final takeaways here. And then that, I think, maybe I'll leave it up there and we can move on to Q&A.
Thank you, all of you, Abigail, Raine, and Cynthia. I just want to remind people that in the chat box will be the link to the evaluation. And when you complete the evaluation, that triggers your participation certificate. So I just wanted to let you know that. And my colleague Diane and I We're hoping to present some questions. We're close to being out of time, but what I would like to suggest is if it's okay with our speakers, that we go beyond our 2:15 time. We understand that people will have to leave, but for those who can stay for at least an extra 10 minutes, that would let us present some of the questions and have our presenters respond to them. So I should check first, is that okay with our presenters? Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to ask all presenters to turn your microphones on, because we will, you can jump in, and sometimes the question may be more specific for one person. I wanted just to start with a sort of a general question, and I'm going to open it up to all three panelists. Do we know anything about the link between virtual violence, such as doxing, and violence in the physical world, and especially against the same individual, and perhaps by someone from the same group of perpetrators, for lack of a better word, who were exhibiting that violence online? So can we start with that?
I have something I'd like to bring up about that, actually. I don't know how many of you have heard of Gamergate. If you haven't, it's worth looking into. There's lots of wikis explaining what it is, but one of the women being harassed to like an incredible degree, Zoe Quinn, had her address leaked, home address and phone numbers and accounts hacked. So the line between the digital violence that she was experiencing kind of like crossed into physical violence when a dead animal showed up in her mailbox, and forced her to leave her home and have to go into hiding. And all of this is in her biography that explains her experiences with Gamergate. But it's like exemplary of like how all online violence is connected to physical violence and can easily swing over, but also when we experience online violence, it affects our mental health and makes us incredibly vulnerable. So it does actually inflict a kind of physical violence.
Thank you, Abigail.
I can add some comments as well that, yes, so in short, yes, research has definitely shown that there is an intimate connection between online violence and offline violence. And this is kind of why, so I think in the past, terms such as cyberbullying and cyber violence, cyber misogyny used to be more popular when cyber was still a cool term. But again, we're trying to move away from that because it kind of sets up a distinction where people tend to trivialize because it's cyber, okay, it's not real. When that online offline distinction doesn't really make sense anymore. We live our lives online. And not only that, but with all of the gamification of extreme violence and far right rhetoric that Abigail has spoken of, there has been research showing that it does move offline very directly. So that happens in three ways. First, that kind of rhetoric and the ideas it promotes are normalized. And people are just generally desensitized to it across the board. So it doesn't even come across as hate speech anymore. It just comes across as like the normal background chatter of the internet, even though it doesn't change its extremely violent meaning. Second is that because of that normalization, it gets mainstreamed into mainstream politics. So it doesn't become, it starts off as far and then it slowly moves towards the middle and becomes more accepted. So one example, I mean, I guess Donald Trump is the most obvious example, but that might not count as mainstream. But a Canadian example is when Maxime Bernier, when he was running for federal government, to be prime minister, or sorry, leader of the Conservative Party, posted something that talked about the red pill, which is a well-known meme associated with far-right men's rights activists, really misogynistic sphere of the internet. And he claimed not to realize what it meant, but it was very much one of those like wink, wink, plausible deniability moments. So here you have a federal, well-known, prominent, esteemed former cabinet minister running for leader of one of Canada's major parties, engaging in what could be passed off at one point was just far-right internet rhetoric. And then again, another direct example is when you look at all the mass shootings, like Christchurch, for example. I can't remember the other ones off the top of my head, but Christchurch is the most prominent example. Oh, and the incel shootings. So for those who don't know, I'm so sorry to bring this into your life, but an incel stands for involuntary celibate, which is again part of the men's rights activist sphere, where men who feel like attractive women who deny them sex are oppressing them, and that men who do get sex are essentially, they're angry that people are not agreeing to have sex with them. And they blame women for this and feminism. And so there have been multiple incel-driven shootings, one in Toronto and elsewhere. That and the Christchurch one were almost launched, almost like a report or project is launched, because they would post a manifesto or something online in conjunction with the shooting. And Kevin Roos at the New York Times has a really great article on the Christchurch shooting. He calls it a mass shooting for the internet by the internet, which just explains these connections and draws them out very well. So yeah, to whoever asked about the distinction between online and offline, they are directly connected, and you can't really consider one without the other.
Yeah, I'll just add that absolutely in the intimate partner violence sphere, we do see it as a continuum. It's a tool, and we know that when a person is considering leaving a relationship, that they are at greater risk as well for tech facilitated violence, and so absolutely, just sort of echoing what my colleagues have shared, is that it is part of this continuum that doesn't end. There's no big wall anymore between what's online and offline. We're all together in all of these spaces, whether it's outside, inside, online, offline. We're all together in it.
Thank you. Diane, if you could present another question.
There's a question that came up during Raine's presentation that anyone could speak to. And it said, are there any resources or advice you would give to help support clients where law enforcement hasn't been able to identify the online harasser and thus nothing proceeds in the criminal justice system?
Oh, I'm sorry, Diana, could you repeat that, please?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, I was
so said, are there
like...
any resources? That's okay. Are there any resources or advice you'd be able to give to help support clients where law enforcement hasn't been able to identify the online harasser and thus nothing proceeds in the criminal justice system?
Yeah, that is a really excellent question. And I should have mentioned that one of the other major barriers to going after the actual perpetrator abuser, and why going after platforms seems so much more attractive in comparison, is because oftentimes you can't find who was the person who was engaging in the harassment or online abuse, because they're pseudonymous or they're anonymous or they're in another part of the world, even if they do know who they are. So there are some legal mechanisms to do that. So a Norwich order, for example, is a particular legal instrument that you can use where you can go to the court and basically make an argument for why the online platform or the ISP should be compelled to reveal to you who that person is for the purposes of then starting the legal proceeding against them. If it's in the context of a criminal case, then this is where I'm a little bit out of my wheelhouse now, because I'm not as familiar with the practice side of things versus the research and policy side of things. But in the context of a criminal case, I imagine that once an investigation is ongoing, there should be a way to compel the platforms to disclose, which again is very much a double-edged tool, because once you have a way to break through anonymity, so many people from marginalized populations also rely on anonymity and pseudonymity to protect their safety, to be able to engage in free expression online with less fear of harassment or people going after them in real life, in the physical world. But yeah, that's a really good question. I know that there are practitioners who are working on it, but it is definitely another barrier to victims and survivors of this kind of violence and abuse.
Thank you. You talked on in different ways, especially Raine, but it came out in other presentations too, of sort of recourse that people can take should they experience the violence that we're discussing today. Can you offer some suggestions in terms of, apart from action to try to get it to stop and seek justice, what else can people do to support themselves and take care of themselves, given this is happening so frequently? Can we start with you, Abigail?
Yeah, I think, and this came out actually in a lot of my discussions with the women who've been, who are public figures who've been impacted by online violence. I think it's really important to foster like an online life, but also an offline life. Like it's important to build networks of friends and family and trusted people to support you when you're being harassed online, and like people that you can like lean into and they can lean into you when you're like facing abuse, especially in contexts where there are a lot of people abusing you and there's no like easy way to find legal recourse. Sometimes you just have to tune out and reacquaint yourself with the people around you.
Thank you. Raine, would you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would also share that, you know, there's as much as for, especially for folks who are experiencing a lot online, it's helpful to have sort of a, what I call a stress busters kit, and whatever that means to you. So whether that is about, you know, reminding yourself to step out of those spaces, whether it's about circling, having a tribe to connect with, your people, your go-to, your gang, your squad, whatever you want to call them, who will rally around you during those challenging times. So whether that's putting them into action to, you know, sometimes flood your feed with positivity, that's incredibly helpful. And so that you can also call on them. So I think that that's a really helpful piece, to gather your squad, and to put them in action, because we've seen that certainly folks who are there to be malevolent and malicious, they certainly have their squad and their go-to force. So I think we need those forces for good and support in our lives as well.
Great, both great suggestions. Diane?
So a few questions have come in recently, one specifically to Raine. So asking if you have a written safety plan that incorporates all the strategies you just, someone else asked, is there a link available for a digital safety planning kit that they could implement for intake?
We don't have something that is a kit necessarily, but we do have sort of a 2-pager of things to go through with someone. I'm happy to share that with you.
That would be wonderful. And if Raine could put it on the web page that's going to host the recording of this webinar,
Yeah, absolutely.
And link back to your website, that would be
Definitely.
Really cool.
There's also some really great work that's been done by the BC Transitional Housing Association. I saw, I think Jane Bailey posted it in the chat. They've also got some really great resources. In the US, the National Network to End Domestic Violence also has really great resources around safety planning and having those conversations. I think that the really key thing is about the critical thinking piece, because we can never keep up with all of everything as fast as it comes out. Because certainly I was in reviewing some of our content, you know, and putting together my slides. I mean, I don't have anything about TikTok in there yet, you know, or a lot of those other spaces that come up so quickly. So it's really about, you know, constantly being formed and thinking critically around safety.
Thank you. One question that I think probably is meant for Cynthia, but perhaps Raine as well. Do we know, are there family lawyers that have the specialty at the intersection of digital platforms and violence against women? And if those individuals exist, are they accepting Legal Aid of Ontario certificates? Or we could think of that more generally, would they be accepting the equivalent in any jurisdiction within Canada?
So there absolutely are, and I think there is a growing number of family lawyers who almost, if they are working with victims, survivors of domestic or intimate partner violence, probably of necessity, are encountering this more and more. I would say I don't, off the top of my head, know a lot of people, but I know people who I'm sure do know people. But I also feel like people in Raine's position who maybe work more on the front lines actually may have more insight into that.
Raine, I think that was a lateral pass over to
That
you.
was.
And well done too.
It's about as sporty as I get to catch that pass. Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's, more and more, a lot of legal clinics are stepping into this arena to support survivors of intimate partner violence. I think that Luke's Place is one, and they're just in Ontario. There's also the Schleifer Clinic in Toronto. I don't think that there's that they might be doing more around this as well, because it's coming up. I can certainly give it a bit of a think and also pass on any resources. I do know of private sector lawyers who are working in this area for sure, a lot more in because I've presented on panels with some for sure. Yeah.
We may be thinking of the same lawyers.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is actually kind of a broader structural issue too. Like in the United States, for example, there are hotlines for this kind of thing. There are digital security hotlines. There are people where if you are in a situation like this, you call up someone, they will walk you through that situation. And we have frontline workers here but it's starting off working in the gender violence space that have then expanded to include technology facilitated violence. But in terms of say a legal aid clinic, a digital security technology focused gender-based violence version of legal aid clinic, there's nothing like that in Canada. And it's really sad because when I work at the Citizen Lab, for example, or I work at other digital rights, more research and policy oriented organizations, because we're some of the only ones that work in this field on an in-depth basis, we'll get calls asking for that kind of frontline help, but we're just not set up to offer that kind of individual support. And on an institutional basis, like there's very little of it just across Canada, and part of that is funding.
Right. I'm afraid I'm going to have to draw us to a conclusion now. I'd like to take this moment on behalf of the Learning Network and the Knowledge Hub team to thank all three of you for your time in planning this, your discussions with us, the knowledge, the personal experiences that you brought to this presentation. One of the comments that came in, I will share with you, this is a paraphrase, but basically it mirrored many other comments that this is fantastic information and this needs to be a whole day of sharing of information. And I think that we're going to remember that this pandemic will end at some point. And I think that it would be wonderful to be able to bring people together in person and to have additional time to be able to discuss these really important issues. So thank you, all of you. And I'm sure there will be people contacting you based on this webinar to make further connections. So with that, thank you also to the over 300 people who stayed for the extended question period. We try to honor the time very closely because we know many people wrote that they had to leave and they were sorry. Don't be sorry, you have jobs to do and families to look after. But for those of you who could stay, thank you for that. And we look forward to seeing others and as many of you as possible in our next webinar. Thank you and bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.